What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and we're continuing our series where we look at how teams performed in one-possession games to find out which teams maybe were overrated or underrated from 2021, or better or worse than their overall record. Let's look at the Big 12 here, and before we look at the 2021 records, let's look back at 2020 and see if there was anything that we could have taken away from that season. You see, Iowa State actually won this division in 2020. This would tell us, based on that 4-1 record, that Iowa State was overrated a little bit, that they were not as good as their record would suggest, and that played out that way this year. Remember, Iowa State came into the season as a top 10 team, and they wound up going, I think, 7-5. So yeah, there was something to that. And like I've said in the other videos, this isn't always the case. It doesn't necessarily mean a team is overrated or underrated going into the next year, but sometimes it does. And really, if you've been looking at these numbers, more times than not, it does. And for Iowa State, that was the case. So we should have looked into that, and we should have said, look, this team won a lot of close games. Maybe they're not quite as good as we think, and maybe shouldn't have put them in the top 10 preseason. Other teams here in the Big 12, and not a whole lot you could take away, but look at Baylor. Baylor was 1-3 in one-possession games, which would tell you they were underrated in 2020. Now, going from 2-7 all the way up to winning the conference, nobody could see that coming, but the 1-3 record should have at least suggested that Baylor was better than their 2-7 record, and that perhaps they were going to be a little bit better in 2021. Like I said, no way you could have known they were going to win the conference. That was just a huge turnaround, but it could at least tell us that Baylor was better than that 2-7 record. So let's get into 2021. These are the top 5 teams in the Big 12. Of course, Oklahoma State. And we're only going by the regular season. I don't like to look at bowl games for this kind of stuff because there are so many factors that go into bowl games with players sitting out and motivation. And you know, those are not necessarily real games. So I don't go to the postseason. I just look at the 12 regular season games and even playing field when we look at all of the teams. So let's look at how these teams were in one-possession games. You see, Oklahoma State was 4-1. Baylor was 3-1, so Baylor turned it around after struggling in one-possession games in 2020. They performed much better in 2021. Oklahoma State 4-1, really good record. Maybe those two teams not quite as good as we thought, but look at Oklahoma, 6-1 in one-possession games. That means there were 6 games that they won that they could have potentially lost if a few plays go differently. So maybe Oklahoma, all those struggles during the season that we thought, well, it's Oklahoma, and we looked at the name brand and we thought, you know, they're going to get it figured out. Maybe this team just wasn't that good last year, and they were fortunate to go 10-2. Iowa State 2-4, so they, you know, performed really well in the close games in 2020, not so well in 2021, and we see that a lot too when we've been looking at these numbers. If a team does really well in the one-possession games, the next year they're probably not going to do as well. It's just kind of how the odds play out. It doesn't always work out that way. Nebraska fans hoping that it works out that way heading into next year. Kansas State was 2-2, so they split their one-possession games. So best case scenario, if these teams had won all of their one-possession games, Oklahoma State would have been 12-0. Baylor, Oklahoma, and Iowa State all could have been 11-1. So when we talk about Iowa State going 7-5 and all the preseason hype, they were a few plays away from going 11-1 or 10-2 and having a great year and going to the Big 12 championship like we expected. Same thing for Oklahoma. If that one loss goes their way, they could go 11-1. So all of these teams these were the real contenders. These are the teams that realistically had a shot. Oklahoma State, Baylor, Oklahoma, and Iowa State. Kansas State could have gone 9-3, but let's look at the flip side. What if these teams had lost all of their one-possession games? Could have been a totally different season for all 5 of them. Oklahoma State and Baylor could have barely been bowl eligible at 7-5. Oklahoma could have been 4-8. Iowa State and Kansas State could have been 5-7. So 3 of the top 5 teams in the Big 12 could have missed out on a bowl game if they had lost their one-possession games. That's how close it is in a lot of these close games, and the Big 12 is a very competitive conference, so you're going to see a lot of one-possession games in this conference, and it's about winning those games. The teams that win those games have a chance, and you see with Oklahoma State and Baylor, they took care of business in their one-score games. They went to the Big 12 championship. Oklahoma played really well in those one-score games also, but they just lost to the wrong team. So how about if these teams had split all of their one-possession games? maybe this is how the standings should have looked if things had kind of averaged out. You still would have Oklahoma State and Baylor at the top. 9.5 wins for Oklahoma State, 9-3 for Baylor. Iowa State actually would have been ahead of Oklahoma at 8-4. Oklahoma 7.5 wins, and then Kansas State still would have been 7-5. They split their one possession game, so it all evened out there for the Wildcats. Looking at the other 5 teams, West Virginia was 6-6, and you see Texas Tech's behind Texas and TCU. When I went in order and put the logos in, I was looking at the actual standings. Texas Tech finished behind them in the conference standings, but we, of course, are looking at overall records here. So how did these teams perform in one possession games? West Virginia was 4-3. Texas was 2-5. So many close losses for the Longhorns. That tells me that Texas might be ready to bounce back next year. We'll see. TCU 3-2. Texas Tech 3-2. So 2 teams that actually had winning records. Actually, 3 of the 5 teams here had winning records in one-score games, and yet they still finished towards the bottom. That, I guess, tells you that they had some bad losses in there as well, where they lost by more than one score. Kansas split their one-possession games at 2-2. If they had won all of their one-possession games, West Virginia would have been 9-3. Look at Texas. Texas was not that far away from going 10-2 last year. So if you're looking for a team to bounce back out of the Big 12, that team might just be Texas. I hate to say that because we always get the Texas is back stuff. Everyone always hypes this team up, but there might be reason this year. There might be reason. TCU at 7-5. Texas Tech could have been 8-4. Kansas could have been 4-8. If they had lost all of their one possession games, West Virginia could have been 2-10. Could have been a much different year for them. Same thing with TCU. Texas could have been 3-9. Texas Tech also could have been 3-9. Kansas could have been 0-12. They did not win a single game by more than one possession. All of their wins, their 2 wins, were one-score games. So how about if the team split all of their one-possession games here? West Virginia would have been 5.5 and 6.5. Texas 6.5 and 5.5. TCU 4.5 wins. Texas Tech 5.5 wins. Kansas 2-10. I know we can't have a half a game, but that's just how the numbers average out. So Texas, yeah, they could have been 10-2. They could have had a great year. Could have been totally different. But just playing the averages, they really should have been probably 6-6 or 7-5. Really no excuse for Texas not making a bowl game. And they blew a lot of leads, had leads in games. Second half, it would get away from them. But that's what's jumping out to me. When you look at these 5 teams, I think it's clearly Texas. Texas is the most underrated team going into 2022 based off of what they did in 2021. Now, I'm not saying Texas is going to be underrated because I'm sure there's going to be plenty of preseason hype. But based off of what they did last year, based off of a 5-7 record, Texas was better than that 5-7 record, and they're a team to potentially watch out for. And then the teams that I think, as we're going to go kind of backtrack here, the teams that are, you're looking at it the other way, teams that might fall off a little bit, teams that are overrated going into next year, Oklahoma State, Baylor, and Oklahoma. And you could throw Iowa State in there with Texas as well, by the way. But those 3 teams might not be as good as their record suggests, or might not have been as good as their record suggests here. Although the bowl games would suggest otherwise. Oklahoma State with a comeback win over Notre Dame. Baylor taking care of Ole Miss, although Matt Corral was not in that game. Oklahoma won their bowl game. So maybe these teams were as good as we thought. Maybe the Big 12 was just better than we thought. I mean, Texas Tech did beat Mississippi State in their bowl game. Kansas State rolled LSU. It was a shorthanded LSU team. So again, there's so many things, so many different layers to this, and we can't look too much into the bowl games. But I think the Big 12 was a quality conference. Oklahoma State, Baylor, and Oklahoma finished at the top because of how they played in those close games. It'll probably be competitive again next year, and it's probably once again going to be about who wins the close games. So if you're looking for 2 teams that, if you're looking for the averages to play out and 2 teams that struggled in the close games that might perform better in the close games next year, it might be Iowa State and Texas, and we'll see if Oklahoma State, Baylor, and Oklahoma can stay at the top of this conference. What are your thoughts on this? Give me your thoughts on the Big 12. Which teams you think maybe were better or worse than their records would suggest? Who do you think is going to be overrated and underrated heading into next season? Comment down below all of your thoughts on the Big 12. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports YouTube channel.